An old African woman sits by a fire in a dimly lit hut, her wrinkled hands stirring a clay pot of herbal tea. Her grandson, Kofi, a young man in his early 20s, leans back against the wooden wall, rolling his eyes as she speaks. The hut is lined with tribal masks, dried herbs, and carved wooden figurines, artifacts of old traditions Kofi no longer believes in. Outside, the moon shines brightly, casting eerie shadows. Some stories are meant to entertain. Others are meant to warn. But what happens when the warning is ignored? When a tale, whispered through generations, is brushed aside as the ramblings of the old? Kofi, a young man from the city, had never believed in his grandmother's stories. He called them myths, laughed at her warnings, and thought himself too smart for such foolishness. But that was before the night everything changed. Grandmother sits cross-legged, eyes gleaming as she recounts the legend of the forest spirit. In a shadowy flashback, villagers walk in fear, avoiding the dense jungle beyond their fields. A monstrous figure, half man, half shadow, watches from the darkness, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. Long ago, before the first roads were carved into the land, there was a spirit that lived beyond the trees. It did not like to be disturbed. Those who wandered too far into its domain never returned. The elders say it has no face, only darkness where its eyes should be. It moves like the wind, silent, unseen, until it is too late. But the worst thing you can do is mock it. Kofi laughs loudly, shaking his head. Come on, grandmother. A faceless spirit. Maybe that scares little kids, but I'm not a child. His laughter filled the room, but his grandmother only sighed. The spirits do not like to be mocked, she warned. But Kofi had already made up his mind. By morning, he would regret it. The next afternoon, Kofi meets his childhood friends in the village square. They sit under a large baobab tree, sharing stories and teasing each other. When he tells them about the spirit legend, they laugh, but one of them dares him to prove it wrong. If you don't believe in the spirit, then go into the forest tonight, one of them smirks. Stay until midnight. If you come back alive, we'll know it's just a myth. Pride is a dangerous thing. And for Kofi, there was no greater challenge than proving others wrong. He smiled, shook his head, and agreed. He would enter the forbidden forest that night, and nothing, he thought, would happen. Night falls. Kofi walks alone through the dense forest, his lantern flickering with every gust of wind. The jungle hums with unseen life, crickets, distant howls, rustling leaves, but something feels off. At first, it was just a normal forest, dark, full of noises, but nothing unnatural. But then, the wind changed. A whisper moves through the trees. The leaves shudder without wind, the shadows seem to shift on their own. Kofi hesitates, suddenly uneasy. And then, the whispers began. Voices, low and breathless, speaking in a language he didn't understand. They surrounded him, calling in his ears like smoke. He spun around, his heart pounding, but saw nothing. Still, he refused to believe. Kofi reaches a clearing, where the trees part to reveal a massive, ancient tree with gnarled roots. His lantern flickers, then goes out. Total darkness. Kofi stood frozen. The jungle had gone silent. No crickets. No wind. Nothing. A shape emerges from the darkness, tall, its limbs too long, its face a shifting void. Its hollow eyes burn with dim, ghostly light. Then, it stepped forward. Kofi could not breathe. The figure had no face, only the memory of one, shifting like smoke. It reached out a long, clawed hand, and spoke. You mock what you do not understand, but now, you will learn. Kofi tries to run, but his feet won't move. The spirit raises a hand, and suddenly, he is somewhere else. He was not in the forest anymore. He was in the past. A ghostly version of the village appears before him. He sees his ancestors, the first villagers, breaking an oath to the spirit. A great fire rages, and the spirit is betrayed, cast away. This was the truth, the reason the spirit was angry. The reason it haunted the forest. It was not a monster. It was a guardian, one that had been forgotten, disrespected, and now it wanted vengeance. Kofi is held back into the real world, gasping for air. The spirit is gone, but its message remains. He had seen it. And he would never doubt again. At dawn, Kofi stumbles back into the village, his clothes torn, his face pale. He collapses before his grandmother, whispering only one thing. "I saw it." He never laughed at her stories again. And from that day, he became the village's storyteller, warning others never to mock the things they do not understand. Some stories are just stories. But some are warnings. Would you dare enter the forbidden forest? Subscribe for more African legends. Comment your thoughts. Kofi stumbled out of the forest, his breath ragged, his skin clammy with sweat. The world around him seemed distant, as if he was still trapped in the nightmare that had unfolded deep within the trees. His lantern had long since shattered, leaving him to navigate by the pale glow of the approaching dawn. His clothes were torn, his hands shaking. But more than anything, it was his eyes, wide, haunted, forever changed, that told the true story. The village was still asleep as he entered, his feet dragging through the dirt road. But a single figure stood waiting outside his grandmother's hut, the old woman herself. Her gaze was knowing, her expression unreadable. She had seen men return from the forest before. Some never spoke again. Others ran mad into the night. And then there were those, like Kofi, whose souls had glimpsed something beyond the veil. "You saw it." Kofi fell to his knees before her, the weight of his arrogance crushing him. He wanted to deny it, to tell her that the spirits were nothing more than wind and darkness. But he could not. The truth had burned itself into his mind. "It spoke to me." Word spread fast. By midday, the village was alive with hushed whispers. Some feared Kofi had been marked, cursed by the spirit that had haunted their land for generations. Others demanded he recount what he had seen. But no matter how many times they asked, his answer was the same. It wasn't just a story. The spirit, it was real. The elders of the village convened, their voices low as they debated what to do. Some argued that Kofi had violated the ancient law, that he had disrespected forces he could not understand. Others believed that his survival meant something greater, that the spirit had chosen him for a purpose. That night, Kofi sat by the fire in his grandmother's hut, his hands wrapped around a bowl of herbal tea. But no amount of warmth could chase away the chill that had settled in his bones. The spirit's words still echoed in his mind. Then he felt it, a burning sensation along his forearm. When he lifted his sleeve, his breath caught in his throat. Etched into his skin, as if carved by unseen hands, was a mark. A symbol unlike any he had ever seen before, glowing faintly beneath the firelight. "Grandmother, what is this?" The old woman's face darkened. She reached forward, running a gentle finger over the mark. "The spirit has touched you. This is a warning." Kofi's stomach twisted. He had entered the forest to prove the spirit did not exist. But now, the spirit had left its mark upon him, a permanent reminder that some things were beyond human comprehension. Days passed, but the mark did not fade. Kofi could feel its presence like a weight upon his soul. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the spirit's shifting form, its hollow eyes burning through the darkness. He could not escape it. And so, he made a choice. He had to go back. Armed with only his grandmother's warning and a single torch, Kofi ventured once more into the forbidden forest. The villagers watched in silence as he disappeared into the trees, unsure if he would ever return. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. The whispers returned, calling through the trees like smoke. But this time, Kofi did not run. He listened. "Why do you return?" Kofi's grip on his torch tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I want to understand." The spirit did not respond. Instead, the world shifted around him. The trees blurred, the ground softened, and suddenly, he was no longer standing in the forest. Kofi found himself in a different time. The village was young, its huts newly built, the people strong and proud. And standing at the center of it all was a man draped in dark robes, his face hidden in the shadows. The villagers knelt before him, their heads bowed. Kofi could hear their murmurs. "We made a pact." Kofi watched as the robed figure lifted his hand. The moment it happened, he understood, the spirit had once been a man, a guardian of the village. But something had gone terribly wrong. A betrayal. A broken promise. And in punishment, the guardian had been cast into the shadows, his form lost to the spirit world. Now, he roamed the forest, seeking justice for what had been done to him. Kofi fell to his knees, his mind reeling. The spirit was not a monster. It was a warning, a reminder of what happens when the past is forgotten. Kofi turned, and the spirit was there, taller than before, its form shifting like mist, its hollow eyes filled with something Kofi had not seen before, sorrow. "Tell them to remember." Kofi gasped as the vision shattered. He was back in the forest, his knees pressed against the damp earth, his torch still flickering beside him. But the mark on his arm burned hotter than before. Kofi returned to the village, his face pale but his mind clear. He gathered the elders and told them everything, the truth about the guardian, the betrayal, the warning that had been left for them. The village listened. And for the first time in generations, they did not scoff. They did not dismiss. Instead, they knelt before the great tree at the edge of the forest and spoke the old words, the ones that had been forgotten. And that night, for the first time in centuries, the whispers in the forest fell silent. Some stories are meant to entertain. Others are meant to warn. But some are meant to be remembered. Kofi had mocked his grandmother's tales, but now, he was the one who carried them forward. He became the village's storyteller, ensuring that no one ever forgot the past again. For in the silence of the forest, the spirit still watched, waiting for those who would dare to forget. Subscribe for more African tales. Comment your thoughts.